I never imagined that tearing down 400 feet of chain link fence on my own land would eventually leave 120 brand new homes sitting in several inches of muddy rainwater. But the truth is, that flood didn't begin with the storm. It began months earlier. The day a developer decided my 40-acre cattle farm was nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle standing between him and a few $1 million in profit. My name is Daniel Brooks. I've spent almost 3 decades working as a civil engineer, specializing in drainage and stormwater systems across Kentucky and southern Indiana. Most people don't get excited about culverts, runoff calculations, or soil absorption rates. I do. Water has rules. Gravity has rules. Land has rules. Ignore those rules long enough, and nature eventually sends you the bill. That's exactly what happened here. I bought my farm when I was 29. It wasn't glamorous. The fences leaned a little. The old barn needed more repairs than I could afford, and every spring I'd spend weeks patching washouts after heavy rains. But it was mine. I raised cattle there, planted hay every season, and watched my daughter grow up riding horses through the same fields my father once worked before me. There was one gravel access road cutting across the eastern edge of the property. It wasn't fancy either, just an old county-approved farm entrance that connected me to the highway. I used that road nearly every day for 30 years. Feed trucks used it. Veterinarians used it. Equipment trailers used it. Nobody ever questioned it because everyone knew it belonged there. Then Horizon Ridge Development bought the neighboring land. Overnight, empty fields turned into bulldozers, dump trucks, concrete mixers, and hundreds of construction workers. I honestly wasn't bothered at first. People have the right to build. Communities grow. New families move in. I even introduced myself to a few workers, brought coffee one cold morning, and figured we'd all be neighbors eventually. The first person who rubbed me the wrong way was the company's owner, a polished guy named Richard Calloway. Expensive boots that had clearly never stepped into real mud, sunglasses that stayed on even while talking to people, and the kind of smile that disappeared the second business entered the conversation. Our first meeting lasted maybe 3 minutes. "Beautiful place you've got," he said while looking past me instead of at me. "Appreciate it," I answered. "Been here a long time." He nodded once. "Well, things are going to look a little different around here soon." At the time, I figured he meant new houses. Turns out he meant my life. About 2 months later, I drove back from town with a trailer full of cattle feed and almost put my truck into the ditch when I saw an 8-foot chain link fence stretching across my access road. Brand new galvanized steel posts, fresh concrete, locked construction gate, and bright orange warning signs hanging every 50 feet. My entrance was gone. Just gone. I parked, climbed out, and stared for a solid minute thinking somebody had made an unbelievable mistake. A construction foreman walked over wearing a reflective vest. "Can I help you?" he asked. I pointed behind him. "That's my farm road." He glanced at a clipboard. "Developer's property now." "No," I replied calmly. "The subdivision starts over there. My easement crosses this section." He shrugged. "You'll have to talk to corporate." Corporate turned out to be Richard. I found him later that afternoon walking through one of the model homes with investors. He looked irritated before I even spoke. "Richard," I said, "you've blocked my access road." He barely slowed down. "Use another one." "There isn't another one." "Then build one." I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. "You expect me to spend thousands building a new road because your crew fenced off mine?" He finally turned toward me. "Daniel, your tractors, cattle trailers, and old equipment aren't exactly helping our property values. Frankly, this solution benefits everyone." I remember staring at him for several seconds before saying, "Except me." He smiled. "Business isn't always fair." That sentence stuck with me far longer than he probably intended. I left before saying something I'd regret. But over the next few weeks, that fence cost me hours every single day. Instead of driving directly into town, I had to take an old county dirt road looping almost 5 extra miles through rough terrain. Delivery drivers complained. Hay suppliers charged additional mileage. Even emergency veterinary visits took longer. Then things got worse. One afternoon, I noticed standing water around my irrigation pump. At first, I assumed a pipe had burst. When I dug around the area, I found fresh excavator damage. One of their crews had crushed a section of underground irrigation line while setting fence posts. The repair bill came to nearly $9,000. I sent photographs, invoices, engineering reports. Everything. Richard never answered. Instead, one of his attorneys mailed me a short letter denying responsibility. That was the moment something inside me changed. Not anger, not yet. Curiosity. Because after nearly 30 years designing drainage systems, I'd learned something important. Careless contractors usually leave fingerprints, and developers cutting corners almost always leave something much bigger. That curiosity ended up saving my farm and destroying Richard Callaway's entire project. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, I poured myself a cup of coffee, climbed into my pickup, and drove slowly around the perimeter of Meadow Creek Estates. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for answers. Engineers develop habits after enough years in the field. We notice things other people never even glance at. The direction water stains run along curbs, the elevation between lots, the spacing of storm drains, the diameter of culverts, the way freshly graded soil settles after a rain. Most people see houses. I see where every drop of rain is supposed to end up. By the third morning, something didn't make sense. The subdivision had over 100 homes under construction, miles of paved streets, sidewalks, decorative ponds, landscaped entrances, but I couldn't find a single proper retention basin. That wasn't just unusual. It was almost impossible. County regulations required developments that size to temporarily store stormwater before releasing it downstream. Every engineer knew that. Every contractor knew that. Every inspector certainly knew that. Yet somehow, there wasn't one. I parked near a utility easement and studied the grading through binoculars. Everything sloped gently toward the eastern edge, toward my property. My stomach tightened. That afternoon, I pulled archived construction permits from the county website. Then I requested grading plans, drainage calculations, environmental reports, and approved engineering drawings. Some documents arrived within hours. Others took several days. I spread everything across my kitchen table until there was barely room left for dinner. My daughter Emily came by one evening carrying homemade lasagna. She looked at the mountain of blueprints and laughed. "Dad, are you solving a murder?" I smiled. "Maybe." She raised an eyebrow. "Whose?" "Mine. Financially speaking." She knew that look on my face. I'd won it before during difficult bridge inspections and emergency flood investigations. It meant my brain had already found something even if I couldn't prove it yet. 2 days later, I drove the property line carrying a survey-grade GPS receiver and an elevation rod. Nobody paid much attention to an older guy wearing muddy boots. They probably assumed I was checking my fences. What I actually found nearly stopped me in my tracks. Hidden beneath fresh grass were several drainage outlets crossing directly under the fence line and emptying onto my pasture. They'd been covered with erosion blankets and decorative landscaping so they blended into the terrain. But once I located the first one, the others practically announced themselves. 8 discharge pipes, multiple concrete headwalls, 2 large culverts. Every one of them pointed toward my land. I followed the flow paths on foot until they disappeared into shallow drainage channels. Someone had excavated across 15 acres of my pasture. Those channels weren't old. They'd been dug recently, shaped carefully enough to look natural, unless you knew what you were looking for. My property had quietly become the subdivision's stormwater storage system. Nobody had asked. Nobody had negotiated an easement. Nobody had compensated me. They had simply assumed my land would absorb runoff from 120 rooftops, driveways, sidewalks, and streets forever. I remember standing there in complete silence. The breeze was moving through the hay. Cattle were grazing peacefully, and all I could think was, they actually believed I'd never notice. They underestimated the wrong man. Back at home, I overlaid the approved county plans with aerial drone photographs I'd taken over the previous several months. The discrepancies jumped off the page. Entire drainage features shown on the approved drawings had never been built. Instead of expensive retention infrastructure, they'd rerouted nearly everything toward my farm. It wasn't an engineering mistake. It was deliberate cost-cutting. Proper detention ponds would have cost millions. Using my land cost them nothing. I contacted an old colleague named Lisa Morgan, an environmental consultant I'd worked with years earlier after severe flooding along the Ohio River. She reviewed my findings without saying much at first. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and quietly said, "Daniel, if this is accurate, somebody signed off on a project that never existed." I asked the question already forming in my head. "How bad?" She answered without hesitation. "If your property stops accepting that water, this subdivision becomes a retention pond." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. I wasn't excited. I wasn't celebrating. Honestly, the realization unsettled me because those homes belonged to families, not just a developer. Kids lived there. Elderly couples lived there. They had no idea what had been hidden beneath the landscaping. That realization made my next decision easy. I documented everything. Every outlet. Every culvert. Every drainage ditch. Every GPS coordinate. Every elevation measurement. Hundreds of photographs. Drone footage after light rainfall. Soil samples. Historical satellite imagery. I organized it into a report almost 300 pages long and delivered it personally to the county engineering office. 3 inspectors visited within the week. Richard happened to see their trucks parked near my property. He drove over wearing the same expensive sunglasses and that same confident grin. "Trying to make trouble again?" he asked. I kept my eyes on the inspectors measuring one of the discharge pipes. "No," I answered. "Just asking the county to explain why your drainage system ends on my land." His smile disappeared for the first time since I'd met him. "You don't know what you're talking about." One of the inspectors looked over. "Actually, we think he does." Richard walked away without another word. The inspection expanded quickly. Within days, county engineers uncovered additional undocumented infrastructure buried beneath landscaped berms. None of it appeared in the final approved construction records. Permits authorizing discharge across my property didn't exist. Easements didn't exist. Environmental approvals didn't exist. Someone had simply built the system and hoped nobody questioned it. The county issued preliminary violation notices while continuing their investigation. My attorney advised patience. "Don't touch anything yet," he said. "Give them the opportunity to fix it voluntarily." So we did. We sent Richard a certified demand letter giving his company 30 days to remove every piece of drainage infrastructure crossing onto my property, restore my damaged irrigation system, compensate me for the access obstruction, and negotiate a lawful entrance agreement moving forward. 30 days. Fair. Professional. Reasonable. Day 10 passed. Nothing. Day 15. Silence. Day 21. One of his attorneys emailed a single sentence saying they disputed all claims. Day 29. I happened to see Richard at the local diner. He walked past my table carrying a coffee and smirked. "Still chasing paperwork?" he asked. I looked up from my breakfast. "Still ignoring certified mail?" He chuckled. "You won't do anything?" I asked quietly. "You really believe that?" He leaned closer. "By the time lawyers finish arguing, every house will already be sold." Then he walked away laughing. That sentence made my decision easier than anything else had. On the morning of day 31, 2 pickup trucks rolled onto my farm, followed by a commercial bulldozer, an excavator, and 3 licensed contractors I'd hired weeks earlier. Every permit required for work on my own property sat neatly inside a binder in my truck. Property surveys marked the exact legal boundary down to the inch. County deputies even stopped by after receiving a complaint from one of Richard's supervisors. They reviewed the documents, compared the survey stakes, nodded once, and wished us a safe day. Richard arrived 20 minutes later in a cloud of dust, practically running across the field. "You can't touch that fence," he shouted. I calmly handed him a copy of the survey. "Watch me." The bulldozer eased forward. Steel posts snapped like matchsticks. 400 feet of chain link collapsed into twisted piles of metal. Next came the culverts crossing my property, then the buried drainage pipes, then every unauthorized ditch carrying runoff across my pasture. We removed only what existed on my land. Nothing more, nothing less. Every bucket of dirt stayed inside my property line. Every foot of excavation was documented by survey crews and recorded on video. Richard screamed, threatened lawsuits, threatened arrests, even claimed I was destroying private infrastructure. One deputy simply looked at him and replied, "Sir, it's only private until it crosses onto somebody else's land." By sunset, the work was finished. My pasture looked scarred, but it belonged to me again. The illegal channels were gone. The drainage outlets removed. The fence blocking my road reduced to scrap steel stacked neatly beside the boundary. As I stood there watching the last loader pull away, dark clouds gathered quietly on the western horizon. The weather forecast called for the biggest summer storm of the season, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, every single drop of rain that fell on Meadow Creek Estates would have to follow the law instead of someone else's shortcut. The rain started just after dinner. Not the kind that rolls in with dramatic thunder and television weather alerts, just a slow, steady summer storm that gradually settled over the valley. I'd seen forecasts calling for around 2 inches over several hours. Nothing historic. Nothing engineers would classify as a 100-year event. In fact, if Meadow Creek Estates had been built according to the approved drainage plans, Nobody would have remembered that storm a week later. I made myself another cup of coffee, sat on the porch overlooking my pasture, and watched the first sheets of rain move across the fields. Water gathered exactly where it was supposed to, on my land, in the natural swales that had carried runoff for decades. The difference was that this time, the subdivision's water wasn't quietly sneaking across my property through illegal pipes and hidden culverts. It had nowhere to go except the system Richard had actually built. About an hour later, my phone buzzed. It was my neighbor Frank. He didn't even say hello. "Danny, you need to come see this." I drove less than 5 minutes before traffic came to a complete stop outside the subdivision entrance. Flashing lights reflected off the wet pavement. Homeowners stood in their driveways staring in disbelief as muddy water crept across sidewalks and into garages. Several basements were already taking on water. Decorative ponds overflowed almost immediately because they had never been designed to hold storm runoff in the first place. Streets became shallow rivers. Storm drains backed up, and every gallon of water that had relied on my pasture for months suddenly had no illegal escape route. I parked along the shoulder and simply watched. Not because I enjoyed seeing families suffer, I didn't. My frustration had always been with one man and the shortcuts he chose, never with the people who had trusted him enough to buy those homes. A young father carrying 2 soaked cardboard boxes looked at me and asked, "Do you know what's happening?" I answered honestly, "I think you're about to learn how your neighborhood was really built." By sunrise, the county engineering department was already on site. They walked the streets, opened utility access points, reviewed original plans, and compared them with what actually existed underground. By the end of the afternoon, inspectors placed red tags on multiple sections of the development and issued emergency notices requiring immediate corrective action. News crews arrived. Drones filled the air. Homeowners demanded answers. Richard spent the entire day moving from one television camera to another, insisting the flooding was caused by an unprecedented weather event. Unfortunately for him, rainfall records are public information, and so are engineering standards. The storm wasn't unprecedented. His shortcuts were. Within a week, homeowners had organized meetings with attorneys. They weren't interested in blaming me after learning the truth. They wanted to know why millions of dollars worth of required stormwater infrastructure had apparently disappeared before construction ever finished. Lawsuits followed almost immediately. The county ordered Meadow Creek Development to construct a fully compliant drainage system at an estimated cost approaching $3 million before additional building permits would be approved. Excavators returned, but this time they weren't installing decorative landscaping or marketing features. They were digging the detention ponds that should have existed from the very beginning. As for me, my attorney filed our own civil case. We documented every extra mile I'd been forced to drive, every irrigation repair, every hour of lost work, every expense related to restoring my pasture, removing unauthorized infrastructure, repairing damaged soil, legal fees, engineering costs, and the long-term impact on my property. The total claim approached $900,000. Richard's insurance company didn't spend months arguing. They reviewed the evidence, looked at the county findings, studied the photographs and surveys, then quietly requested mediation. We reached a confidential settlement less than 3 months later. I can't discuss every detail, but I can say this: my farm was restored, my losses were covered, and a brand new gated entrance now sits exactly where my original access road always belonged. Meadow Creek Estates eventually received its proper drainage system after nearly a year of construction. Ironically, the neighborhood became far safer than it had ever been under Richard's original design. 6 months after the settlement, his development company filed for bankruptcy. I heard he blamed lawsuits, bad weather, rising construction costs, pretty much everyone except himself. But deep down, I think he always knew the truth. None of this happened because I removed a fence. None of it happened because I dug up a few pipes on my own land. It happened because someone convinced himself that private property, engineering standards, and basic honesty were obstacles instead of boundaries. Nature doesn't negotiate with shortcuts. Gravity doesn't care about profit margins. Water doesn't read marketing brochures. It simply follows the path that's available, and when people illegally steal that path, sooner or later, the bill comes due. Every time I drive through my gate now, I still glance toward that subdivision. Kids ride bicycles down those streets. Families mow their lawns. Life goes on, and I'm genuinely glad it does. They deserved a neighborhood built correctly from the beginning. The only person who truly lost everything was the one who believed cutting corners would never catch up with him. Now I'd really like to hear what you think. If you had been standing in my boots, would you have removed the fence and the illegal drainage the moment those 30 days expired? Or would you have given the developer one more chance? Do you believe the flooding was entirely Richard's responsibility? Or should I have considered the impact on innocent homeowners before exercising my legal rights? Share your opinion in the comments because I'm genuinely curious where you stand on this one. And if you enjoy true stories about property disputes, legal battles, and ordinary people standing up for themselves the right way, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.